friends! Which of these foods do you think makes insulin resistance worse, which is linked to Alzheimer's dementia, informally called type 3 diabetes? So, this piece of white sourdough bread, these beans, lunch meat, or this stick of butter. And only one of these will continue to reduce your blood sugars the day after you eat it. And one of these will spike your blood sugars really high, and two of these will just make that spike worse because they make you more insulin resistant. Why does it even matter? If you know anything about the brain, you know that the brain can absorb sugar regardless of insulin. However, when you have insulin resistance, that messes with your fatty acid levels in your blood, and you will see elevated triglycerides. When you have elevated triglycerides in your blood vessels, you elevate your lipoprotein levels, which increases inflammation, causing atherosclerosis, ultimately reduces the delivery of nutrients like glucose to your brain. This then affects both the brain's energy and structure. Now, in dementia, you don't just run out of gas. You actually lose brain cells, and that's why your brain shrinks. So knowing the biochemistry and pathophysiology caused by the wrong foods hopefully will help you avoid them so that you can reduce your risk of insulin resistance. And really, every single tissue in your body will be affected, but they're affected differently. Now, unlike your muscles, your brain doesn't need insulin to absorb any of this glucose from this white starch. But insulin does serve multiple other functions, including controlling your appetite. Now, complex, isn't it? Understanding the connection between insulin, glucose, your appetite, and dementia isn't as simple as achieving normal or low blood sugars, insulin, or hemoglobin A1C numbers, even though lots of social media influencers want you to believe that. And drugs that improve your blood sugars, so you think you can tolerate this, well, they don't treat dementia. Now, the wrong diet advice may produce pretty lab values, but you may be just sacrificing the structure of your brain to have those good numbers. And it's not going to be worth it in the long run. It's like cheating to get an A on a test. I consider cramming the night before a form of cheating. Are you really learning anything? You're cheating yourself out of learning. And I know lots of people that do that and then forget everything a week later. I have here a replica of the brain. It's about this size. And your brain works the same way. Learning, creating, thinking, moving prevents dementia because it builds brain tissue. There's no shortcut that makes up for a poor diet and lifestyle when it comes to the health of your brain. Did you know that free fatty acids are well known to be one of several causes of insulin resistance in your muscle? And when your muscles are insulin resistant, then that means after you eat this white bread, it won't store the glucose in this starch to glycogen. If you put butter on this white bread, you actually get a surge of free fatty acids from this butter, and that then surges your blood sugar after eating this white bread even longer. And over time, when you keep repeating this fat with carbs, you increase the need for insulin. That's called insulin resistance. And this is because fat from this butter downregulates your insulin receptors, which essentially turns off your mitochondria's ability to process this white starch. The same thing will happen when you add your butter to coffee. And this is why influencers tell you when you eat fat, you can't eat carbohydrates like starch. Simply put, your body doesn't have the bandwidth to metabolize both types of energy at the same time. The presence of fat inhibits your body's ability to process starch. However, regardless of whether or not you eat starch, your insulin receptors will be downregulated in the presence of fat. That means you will have less insulin receptors, which will make you insulin resistant even if you don't see high blood sugars. That's simply because without insulin receptors, your insulin cannot work. It's like visiting your grandmother, but her doorbell was removed. If grandma is hard of hearing, then she won't answer the door and you will never get in. And no matter how many grandchildren show up, she still won't let people in because she doesn't realize people are outside waiting. And this is a problem with glucose metabolism. It will wait indefinitely when there is insulin resistance caused by so many ways, and eating lots of fat is one of them. Now, pretty soon, some of her grandkids will be tired and start leaning against the wall. And in California, if you did that, you would be destroying her stucco. So essentially, you'll be breaking grandma's foundation of her home. You're causing inflammation to the wall. And this is what happens when glucose hangs out in the blood vessels too long. It breaks the walls of the blood vessels. And you have blood vessels all over your body, including your brain. The blood vessels in your brain form a protective barrier called the blood-brain barrier that normally prevents toxins from getting into your brain. If your glucose is too high, you break that blood-brain barrier. And then you will be letting in a lot of things your brain shouldn't get in. I hope that you now understand why butter and bread is a worse combination of food to eat. And one way to eliminate the high insulin requirements is to maybe eliminate the bread. But are you really reversing the pathophysiology when you do that? When you're eating fat? There is still going to be less insulin receptors. And this is why when you challenge yourself after you go on a high-fat diet, you have problems tolerating anything with sugar and starch. You get really high blood sugars. High blood sugars is a symptom of insulin resistance, and you won't see it unless you eat starch and sugar like bread. But once you have the insulin resistance, you really don't have to eat butter to have free fatty acids in your blood. That's because your body has its own personal store. Pinch that love handle on your abdomen. People with diabetes, they constantly release their own free fatty acids as triglycerides from their own fat cells. That's how energy is stored, in triglycerides. And normally, when you eat starch and sugar, it stimulates the release of insulin that tells your fat cells to store this extra sugar or starch if you're not burning it off. And it stores it as free fatty acids. But when a person becomes insulin resistant, even the fat cells, they refuse to store the excess calories. And that's another mechanism of insulin resistance. Complex, isn't it? Now, to some people, this whole concept may seem okay for your brain because you would think you have an advantage for your brain to have an endless supply of free fatty acids because you think it's fatty. However, people don't realize that fatty acids are not just energy molecules. They're also signaling molecules. And when you have high triglycerides, it actually messes with your brain's regulation of appetite. It induces central leptin and insulin receptor resistance. Leptin is needed to turn off your appetite. When you have leptin resistance, you lose control of your appetite and you tend to eat more. Have you ever felt out of control with your food and eating even though you're not hungry? Maybe it's because it has also changed your dopamine levels and it increased your dopamine to drive you to seek to more pleasurable foods. Basically, it makes you behave like an addict when it comes to eating foods. In addition, high triglycerides, they also contribute to dementia by reducing blood flow. Remember, when it hangs around, it causes inflammation, atherosclerosis in the blood vessels. And when you eat fat, you prevent yourself from breaking down your own fat. Some of you may have a hard time believing this, that when you eat fat, you get more insulin resistant. Well, they've done this study a long time ago. They split normal people into 4 food groups. One got no food, so they fasted. One had a high fat diet. One had a high protein diet. And one had a high carb diet. And guess which group, after getting a carbohydrate tolerance test, meaning they were all challenged with the same amount of carbs, performed the worst on their blood sugar levels? Well, you probably didn't guess it. It would be the fasting diet, that means no food, and the high-fat diet. So clinically, we see this, and we've been seeing this for a long, long time. And that's why processed foods with both ingredients makes your blood sugars even worse. However, eating fat is very different than breaking down your own fat, because when you eat fat, you actually get an extra dose of LPS, or lipopolysaccharide, that are found in the outer layers of gram-negative bacteria. Now, you have trillions of bacteria in your gut, and super high lipopolysaccharide levels are known as endotoxin, the same stuff that causes sepsis, which is severe inflammation in multiple organs to cause organ failure, including in your brain. Dementia is, in essence, organ failure. Now, the term metabolic endotoxemia happens when you consume fatty foods, because fatty foods cause the formation of chylomicrons. You have to have a transportation system to process the fat. That's your chylomicrons. Making chylomicrons increases the absorption of lipopolysaccharide to cause a chronic inflammatory state in the body. This phenomenon can happen with just one meal, eating one emulsified saturated fat meal like butter or coconut oil. And you can actually reduce it if you switch your oil quality to polyunsaturated fatty acids. You know how you feel when you eat a pretty heavy meal? Well, this could be causing your food coma. That's abnormal. When my mom was around, we used to go eat at this Chinese restaurant every weekend. And if you've ever eaten Chinese food, a lot of it is super greasy. It's fried, it's stir fried in oil. And I never felt bad eating it. At least I didn't think I did. Well, ever since I became more strict on my diet and I don't eat out with greasy, oily stuff anymore, I feel so different when I go back to it if we go out for a restaurant for some special event. I honestly can't eat stir-fried foods from restaurants or deep-fried foods anymore. It makes me feel so bad after I eat it. And I never noticed this difference until I stopped doing it. Well, what does this have to do with dementia? Well, it turns out Alzheimer's patients have a higher than normal level of LPS endotoxin in their blood. And amazingly, normal people have volunteered to have lipopolysaccharide injected in their blood, and it actually induced memory problems. Now, when they experimented on mice with LPS, it caused little mice to get amyloid plaques and tau tangles. Now, people aren't mice, but I can attest that lipopolysaccharide is deadly, and it changes people's brain. You know, people oftentimes get microscopic intestinal perforations that we can capture in blood cultures, and they can get so sick that they end up obtunded in the ICU. Now, if they recover, they are never the same. Oftentimes, they continue to have this ICU brain. Initially, they're confused on location and time and whether it's night or day. We call it sundowning. Now, if you get a frank perforation, we can capture this on blood cultures and on diagnostic imaging, like maybe an X-ray if it's big enough or CT scans. And surgeons can oftentimes see this in surgery. The larger the perforation, the higher the burden of LPS, the deadlier the condition. So it's not uncommon to get a lethal dose of LPS when you're septic. Septic patients often present with personality changes and the inability to stay awake. My mom had sepsis. I picked her up one day for a routine doctor's appointment, but she had this odd facial expression when she got in the car. I mean, she literally locked her door, walked into my car, and could answer some simple questions, but there was just something odd about her that day. She wasn't herself. And all she could say was she wasn't feeling so great. And at the doctor's office, she had a rapid pounding heart rate and a temperature of almost 103. And I was flabbergasted that that doctor didn't have a blood pressure meter. So I left that doctor's office. We went straight to the emergency room, and that's when her blood pressure tanked. Luckily, in the emergency room, they were able to get her some fluids and antibiotics to treat her infection. She had urosepsis. So she had sepsis from her bladder. So you don't have to perforate your gut to have sepsis. Really, any part of your body exposed to germs is a potential source of LPS. And had I not shown up at my mom's house that day, well, she probably wouldn't have made it.
Hi, friends. I am so thrilled that you want to take charge of your health and take charge of your food. Now, I know nutrition can be complex, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm here to support you in this lifelong journey. So if you point your camera app to this QR code, it'll take you to a link for a free handout that I created just for you. And if you like it, if you want to see other handouts, please go to the link in my show notes, and then you can leave me your feedback on what I could do to help you in your journey. Okay, back to the video now.
Now, many of you know that the brain can use ketones as fuels. So why don't we just all give up carbohydrates like this white bread? Because it's going to just spike your sugars. And by the way, did you know that white bread will spike your sugar higher than if you eat table sugar? And that's because white bread is made out of starch, which is pure glucose. But when you eat table sugar, only half of that is glucose. The other half is fructose. And between eating candy and white bread, I'd rather eat white bread because fructose is known to be a liver toxin. Blood sugar machines aren't designed to measure fructose. That's why we don't see it even higher. But we know fructose increases fat in your liver, makes your liver insulin resistant. And this is another way to get insulin resistance. But really, is a solution to quit all carbohydrates? Let's take the metabolism of an athlete. A Kenyan Boston Marathon runner could easily eat up this white bread and use all of the glucose just with a light jog. In Kenya, the dementia rate is 9% in those who are older than 60. In the USA, they predict our risk of developing dementia is 42% after age 55. Now, I don't know about you, but that's just not going to happen to me. But for me to be successful, I have to pick the right diet. So I really need to know what eating glucose will do to my brain. And it's been shown that it's in Alzheimer's disease, the ability of astrocytes and microglia to metabolize glucose decreases. But astrocytes are not neurons. They do, however, play important support roles for neurons to supply them with energy. And this is why some people think that supplying enough ketones through eating fat can bypass the inability of the cells to use glucose. However, the problem with why they can't process glucose correctly is because the brain has lost mitochondria. So just supplying more energy and ketones is not going to fix the underlying problem of a lack of mitochondria. In fact, it may accelerate the problem and cause more oxidative stress. Oxidative stress destroys mitochondria, and this is the price we pay by making energy. And the more ATP energy you make, the higher the oxidative stress. It's like a battery for your computer. Have you ever noticed that it gets really hot when you're overusing it and then it shuts off? Well, mitochondria are the batteries of your cells. And every time you make ATP, you make energy, you're also going to dissipate toxins that are created from generating that energy. These toxins give your brain oxidative stress and literally can kill mitochondria and brain cells. So metabolizing ketones from fat just means you're generating more ATP and more oxidative trash that comes with it. And if you don't have a plan to take care of that oxidative trash, it just destroys tissue. Now, I know some people have reported that they feel better and think better when they're on a ketogenic diet. And I don't discount that because half the benefit of doing a ketogenic diet is just to remove the toxins that was in your diet before you started, like in this refined bread. But the lack of energy is not the only problem with dementia. Have you ever seen the brain scan of a person with dementia? Or maybe a person with strokes? Well, demented people and people who have strokes, they have holes in their brain. That indicates that their brain is shrinking. They have lost and will continue to lose brain cells. And it's not just because you lack energy. It's actually a structural problem. The foundation of your memory is an internet of neurons and glial cells that make the structure of your brain. So every time you learn, you are building synapses. You are growing arms on neurons. You're actually growing more neurons. This builds more brain tissue, the hardware of your brain. This strengthens your brain to protect you from dementia. But you don't just need more brain tissue, you actually need the right signaling molecules called neurotransmitters. And bad marketing has convinced people to perk your brain through stimulants like caffeine and sugar. Have you ever tried an energy drink or maybe a blended coffee drink? Do they actually make you smarter or just land you in the ED faster? By now you know that that is not my way of life. I don't do temporary fixes because it may not actually fix the problem. But I do eat a diet high in the right carbohydrates. And why is that? Now, before you go off and say, I don't know anything about nutrition because I'm a medically trained doctor, I want you to keep in mind that I'm also a professional learner. Now, athletes, they train their bodies to perform for their competitions. Well, medical doctors, including myself, we've been training our brains to perform in competitions our whole life. We have taken countless numbers of tests. We write thousands of essays charting. We care for our families and our tens of thousands of patients. We drive on the freeways. We go to church. Essentially, what we're doing is engaging with real people and actively training our brains to prevent dementia. But I'm in it for the long run, not just for short-term performance. And that's why I meticulously eat certain foods and I avoid others. No, I didn't learn nutrition in medical school, nor did I learn how to be an infectious disease doctor in medical school, nor did I learn how to make YouTube videos in medical school. And by the way, a neurosurgeon never learned how to perform neurosurgery in medical school. That's not the job of medical school. School, no matter where you're going, what degree you get, just teaches you how to learn. And if you stop learning after you graduate from school, well, you just wasted that degree. And the reason why I would never go low carb is because it turns out the brain needs sugar for structure, but you have to eat the right type. This carbohydrate has no antioxidants. I wouldn't eat this. But this carbohydrate is full of antioxidants. These are black beans. They are colored with antioxidants. Because every time you eat molecules that potentially can turn into energy for your brain, whether it's fat or sugar, you're going to produce a ton of oxidative stress. And this is why eating white refined flour doesn't help you manage the toxins from the energy that this will generate. Neither will eating butter. But unlike eating these foods, when you eat foods rich in antioxidants, they help you mitigate the oxidative stress. And this is the problem with social media. People have simplified the body's biochemistry to the point that they're damaging their health, not protecting their brain. And we have an astronomical rate of dementia. It's like playing in the stock market. You really going to think that you can time the market, predict which stock is going to hit the jackpot? You're going to lose your shirt in the long run, not have a retirement account. You're basically playing with fire when you're playing in the stock market, limiting it to one stock. Likewise, when you focus on food as a pure energy source when it clearly isn't, you neglect the structural maintenance of your brain to keep it healthy. And by the way, nobody has an energy problem, folks. We have an overabundance of energy no matter what you pick to eat, whether it's glucose or fat. That's not the problem in our modern world. We are full of energy. In fact, most of our diseases are an abundance and overindulgence of energy. And the average American has a grade A+++ in consuming energy-rich foods. But we have neglected the vital role of nutrition, which is to remodel your entire body, to build structure and to protect its structure. Hence, we have an obsession on the wrong low-carb diets focused on energy and inadvertently neglecting the important role of glucose to build structure of your brain and the antioxidants that can come with that glucose to protect your brain structure if you eat the right ones. Now, glucose, remember, only makes up half of the sugar in table sugar. And so you're eating, on the average, 70 pounds of that chemical a year. So the other half is fructose, which the brain can't use for energy nor structure. And we know that causes insulin resistance, especially in the liver, and it also causes gout. And this is why when you change your diet and just cut out refined sugar, you significantly improve your insulin resistance. Now, the vast majority of the glucose used by your brain is for energy. And this accounts for 20% of your total body's energy expenditure, despite being only 2% of your body weight. But glucose, like I said, is essential for structural maintenance. Now, the brain typically needs a total of 100 to 120 grams of glucose per day in a normal diet. And when your carbohydrate intake is low, and ketones derived from fat, whether you're eating it or you're breaking your own, can replace up to 60 to 75% of the brain's energy needs. But it can't help your brain for its structural needs. Now, luckily for everyone, including those on a ketogenic diet or for people not eating, people fasting, your liver can make up to 30 to 50 grams of glucose a day through gluconeogenesis by converting protein into sugar. Now, you can't store protein, but you have muscle. So your body breaks down your own muscle to supply protein to your liver to make glucose for your brain. So you're sacrificing your own muscle tissue. Does that sound like a good idea to you? I'm literally trying to build muscle, but you don't build muscle by eating protein. You build muscle by exercising. So this is why I walk every day, 10,000 steps at least. I do Pilates twice a week, and then I do weight training twice a week. And I realize the older I grow, the more time I have to spend in investing in building my muscle. And when you eat extras protein, you can't store any of that. It just turns into your love handles, your fat. So unless you're exercising to build that muscle to use that extra protein, you probably need to lay off of it unless you're remodeling tissue, right? Recovering from surgery. So when you're not exercising and then you go on a ketogenic diet, you're going to lose muscle mass rapidly because your brain needs to make up for that missing glucose, which, by the way, is also needed for your immune cells, red blood cells, and eye cells. And you can actually measure your calf shrinking when you start your ketogenic diet. But this is not unique to the ketogenic diet. This is true for any quick weight loss scheme. Your muscle is your number one metabolic buffer to prevent you from getting insulin resistant. Do you think it's a good idea to lose it? Hence, I'm not an advocate for any quick weight loss scheme, whether it's pouring down bottles of olive oil or injecting yourself with a medicine that suppresses your appetite. So in order to build brain cells, you're going to need cell membranes. And without cell membranes, you can't make a cell, right? Because it holds the entire cell together. Well, your brain can make new cells as long as you keep learning something new. But if you're not going to have enough equipment to build those cells, if you limit what your brain needs to make those cells. And remember, your whole body needs to make new cells. So the brain is always in competition with your body for nutrients. And usually it wins. It gets first dibs in supply. So if you run out of equipment like glucose because you're not eating enough carbohydrates, you're not going to be able to repair your fastest growing cells, like your immune cells, your white blood cells, or your cells in your GI tract, if your brain is taking up all that glucose. And these cells, their job is to protect the brain, right? Because if these cells don't do its job, then you have a breach in your immune system and you get sick. And we all know how that feels, right? Your brain doesn't feel so good when you're sick. Did you know that every time you eat, you're destroying and killing some of those cells just by sheer friction? It's like road rash. When you're eating food, it has to slide down your esophageal road into your intestinal road to then ultimately get pooped out. Have you ever slid down a slide in shorts? That's massive road rash on your thighs. I used to hate going down a slide in shorts, especially in the California heat. Well, that's your food going down your food pipe. And you'll really feel it if you cut yourself accidentally, right? My friend didn't chew a tortilla chip correctly, and it literally sliced his esophagus open. Obviously, he needed surgery. Eating is traumatic, folks. Chew your food well. And even if you chew your food well, dry foods have jaggedy edges like potato chips and crackers, and you're forcing your body to push it through a pipe. That requires a lot of energy to digest your food, just pushing it and then having the enzymes to metabolize it. And hence, we all need to give our body a break and stop eating food. I don't know if you realize this, but your digestive tract is paper thin, and you are damaging it left and right when you swallow food. So that's why I don't get some people drink vinegar without diluting it. It's going to damage some of your cells in your GI tract. I literally use vinegar to clean my vegetables because I'm trying to kill the germs in my vegetables. And if you keep doing that, one day you're going to rupture your esophagus. Hence, do not drink undiluted vinegar or alcohol. Cells in your GI tract needs to be placed on a daily basis. And you can't make cells unless you have glucose to make the cell membranes for any part of your body. And that includes your GI tract, your immune cells, and your brain. But you don't just need cell membranes to make cells. You actually need DNA, the genetic material, basically the computer chip of the cells. Do you know what DNA stands for? Deoxyribonucleic acid. Ribose is what makes ribo. It is only made out of glucose. And ribose is the essential backbone to make nucleotides that make both DNA and ATP. So if you limit your body's access to glucose, well then you're really going to limit your body's ability to repair, regenerate, and grow new cells, including new brain cells. Now, I'm not done yet. Why do you think you can move around without being a blob? You're held by connective tissue. It's literally kind of a tape. Have you heard of these terms? Maybe hyaluronic acid, chondroitin sulfate, heparin sulfate, keratin sulfate. These are molecules that make connective tissue, and they are all made out of glucose. I'm sure you've heard of collagen. You may be eating some collagen peptides. Well, you can't use your collagen properly unless you can glycosylate it or add glucose to it to make it strong. There's a syndrome of connective tissue disorders called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, in which a subset of people can't put glucose on their collagen to stabilize their connective tissue. And this results in super hyperflexible digits, but they also have super hyperflexible spine that can cause them scoliosis. They have poor wound healing. They have heart valve defects, malabsorption difficulties, and neurological problems, including blood vessel problems like with POTS, or they have chronic headaches. I just listed a lot of different things that happen to people who don't have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Maybe they're not giving their body the right equipment, enough glucose to glycosylate. So if you're struggling with poor wound healing, bad skin, joint pains, brain fog or headaches, and you're on a low-carb diet, you're probably putting yourself in the same ultimate position as a patient with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome by restricting your body's ability to glycosylate your collagen. Now, of course, this isn't medical advice, so if ever you're wondering if that is happening to you, go see your own medical doctor and have a discussion with them. Connective tissue doesn't just make joints, but they hold your entire body together. It makes the sacs that surround each of your organs. It holds your muscles, your skin, both outside and inside, your blood vessels, including the ones in your brain. And when you're missing connective tissue, you get aneurysms and high blood pressure areas like your aorta. You can get spontaneous pneumothoraxes, which can cause a collapse of your lung. You can get perforations in your intestines. You have joint stability and maybe early osteoarthritis. You may be getting chronic pain and fatigue. These are very, very common conditions that are happening at an astronomical rate in America. And they happen to people who actually don't have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And this is the importance of getting your diet right. When you eat food, you are rebuilding tissue. You're not just getting energy. And low carb diets may help you in the short term to improve your cardiovascular risk because you eliminate all the junky refined carbs. But the wrong low carb diet in the long term appears to increase your overall mortality. Now, we can't have a randomized trial to prove this, just like we can't randomize people to perform tobacco or asbestos exposure trials. It's just not going to be ethical. But I think we all agree that tobacco and asbestos is bad for the human body because people who have more exposure seem to have more problems and poor outcomes. It's really a dose-response relationship. And you can show dose-response relationships with diets, including low-carb diets. And in theory, a low-carb diet seem to be beneficial for diabetes, but is it really? Well, it's been shown to be the opposite. Over a 30-year period, people who are hardcore on eating a low-carb diet, they are at higher risk of getting type 2 diabetes. But we know not all low-carb diets are the same. And people who focus their low-carb diets on animal protein, even if it's lean or even if it's like sirloin steak, well, you basically increase your risk of diabetes. While those who do more of a whole food, plant-based low-carb diet and eliminate refined carbohydrates, they actually can reduce their risk of diabetes. And this is also true for people who already have diabetes. So if you want to know the foods that will reverse your insulin resistance and protect your brain, watch the next video.